Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, as Ukraine war. Well, no, it's not. This is a geopolitics breaking news update, or at least an update on what is going on in Syria with some reflection from a Ukrainian-Russian point of view, the impact that the events in Syria might have on Ukraine and might have on Russia. Let's go to Syria and the news first, bearing in mind that this is just an eclectic mix of things I've picked up. I'm just a news aggregator. If you want, proper in-depth reporting, go to your mainstream media news to get the latest pictures and whatnot out of Syria. But this is just a selection of, I think, nuggets to try and get a sense of what's going on. And obviously, Syria has fallen to the rebels. There are however many rebel factions, maybe 7 factions, some supported by the US, some supported by Turkey, some who are proper Islamic jihadists, and the HTS group that have done most of the activity in the last week, led by a chap who has been somewhat more, I guess pluralist and reformist in the last recent times, because actually there were some worrying aspects of the HTS in terms of where they would take Syria, what his views were, etc., etc. So there are so many unknowns, so many variables going on here. What I think the prevailing thought is among many Syrian people is that, however unsavory some of the factions might be, they are orders of magnitude better than the Bashar al-Assad regime that has been a dynasty of Ba'athist horror for decades, and it has been particularly bad since Russia got themselves involved in, I think, 2015 to bring their military might against what they used to call the terrorists. I say used to because today they are starting to call what they previously called regional terrorists. They're starting to call them Syrian opposition because they know that they are done for there, and they're changing their rhetoric accordingly. Okay, so in the past few hours, there's no reports, some time ago actually, several airstrikes were reported in the Daraa province, reportedly by the Israeli Air Force, which is interesting. So the Israelis seem to be involved there as well at the moment. We have news that there are air bases being struck. This is an airbase outside Damascus, struck by Israeli fighter jets, possibly to destroy equipment before it falls into the hands of rebel forces. So the Israelis are a little worried about chemical warfare equipment, any other type of military equipment. There are still, as I said, so many variables that the Israelis are going to be thinking that, right, this is good. Okay, so we've got Iran out of the picture now with regard to their support of the Assad regime and their support of Hezbollah that went across Syria from, you got Iran, then you got Iraq, then you got Syria, then you got Lebanon, and they were getting arms all the way across there, through Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon, and the Israelis were not happy with that, and so they had a vested interest here. You had the Turks having a vested interest, and they will probably be the central, maybe kingmakers, if you like. They'll play a very central role in where Syria goes from now. And there are worries, right? There are certainly potential issues as to what might evolve in Syria. Just some more footage here of Israel reportedly carrying out airstrikes at a research center in Damascus believed to be developing Iranian missiles. So that this will be of benefit to Ukraine. For example, if Iranian missiles end up being sent to Ukraine via Russia, or sent into Ukraine, as in as weapons of war flying through the air to hit Ukrainian infrastructure, sent by the Russians, then if the Israelis can take these facilities out now, then that might have a benefit down the road for Ukraine. But yeah, going back to what's going to go on now, is going to be something that is incredibly febrile, chaotic. There will be interest from the US, although the US is in turmoil itself, just by on point of fact that it's going through a transition of administrations. But you also have one administration having a very different idea, possibly, about what should happen, what might happen as the other administration. Although you'd hope that the Department of Defense and intelligence intelligence entities within the US might have that kind of consistency through those administrations. But you can have Turkey, the EU, all these players very much interested in what happens in Syria. Syria is a bit of a linchpin in that whole region. It kind of connects everything, and it's also brought into play all these nefarious entities like Iran, like a lot of terrorist organizations, potentially, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and of course Russia. Anyway, rebel forces have entered Latakia and Tartus and also control the Kurdish border crossing into Turkey. The fate of Chemin air base and the port of Tartus, which at the moment host Russian forces, or at least have done. We're really not sure what's gone on with them, and as no report says here, is not yet known. This is going to be very interesting to see if any equipment is left behind there, and whether the Russians are in a bit of a bind, whether they actually lose any troops. In fact, if we go to some of the Russian views I've got set up here to talk to you about, according to a German journalist in Russia, Ina Rook, the Russian Foreign Ministry claims that, quote, it has allowed Assad's fall and expressed its wish to keep its bases in Syria. They are hoping that the new leaders are going to accept that. Wow. Right. Will that happen? Almost certainly not. I can't imagine that those rebels who have been fighting against the Assad regime and Russia, knowing that Russia have been the ones bombing the crap out of Aleppo and all of these places, Homs and whatnot, for years, I can't for a second think they want Russia to remain there. Russian military blogger Razvedos reports that there are groups of Russian soldiers in Syria who are surrounded with no chance of escape. So this is from a Russian source. Quote, it's clear that I dreamed this, but at least one group of Russian military personnel is still cut off from our main bases in the region. They have no chance of breaking through on their own. There is nowhere to expect help. That is, there is no military solution to this problem, but there is still something political. I sincerely hope that the issue will be resolved and our compatriots will not be forgotten. They will not forget in the literal sense. Hang in there, friend, and may the force be with you. Yeah. So Russians potentially surrounded in places. Now, Kurdish forces have reportedly begun blocking certain Russian military facilities in the Trans-Euphrates region, according to Rebar. He adds that the Russian positions at the oil refinery in the Homs Desert are also blocked. Indeed, more translated says, at this point, the Russian presence in Syria is not just hanging by a thread, as Rebar claims, it is essentially eliminated. There will be no Russians in Syria and subsequently none in Africa either. This is called checkmate. I agree with the rest of what was said. So let's actually dip into Rebar to see what the Russian sources are saying. Russian nationalistic, pro-Kremlin sources are saying. So Rebar says, one can draw some disappointing conclusions. Russia's military presence in the Middle East is hanging by a thread. Seeing a lack of activity of the Russian group of troops, forces in the SAR Kurdish formations began to block individual objects of the Russian armed forces in the Euphrates region. Jebla is under the control of armed groups. The Khmeimim base is cut off. Russian military ships have been withdrawn from the port of Tartus to the roadstead in order to reduce the threat from rogue gangs who have decided to fire on them. Positions at the oil refinery in the Homs Desert are also blocked. We have no right to talk about the plans of the Russian military leadership. What was decided in high offices has absolutely no significance on the ground, simply because there was no initiative on the ground. Waiting for instructions from Moscow on Sunday, not understanding that it was necessary to act outside the framework of the system, to attempt another attack on Pristina or to rush to the defence of South Ossetia did not work out. At the time, I'm not quite sure the references there, these were the very events that went down in history and glorified Russia precisely because people on the ground acted on their own initiative. So, okay, the idea is there are certain events that have happened in the Russian recent past militarily where people have taken initiative and there's been glory because they've done that rather than waiting for the orders from above. But as we know, the Russians are reticent to do things without the requisite orders from on high, taking on much more than was allowed by the instructions or directions that no one gave. This time everything was done systematically, correctly, inertly and indifferently, in other words. So I think that's some pretty damning views on what's going on there. Interesting, some claims here, which actually we'll wait for that. We'll wait for that because that is, I think, a really significant outcome that's negative for Ukraine. But we'll get to that later. So first of all, let's just have a look at some of the footage that's coming out. So here's a destroyed Pantsir S1 air defense system near Damascus. So a really pretty decent bit of Russian air defense equipment, although Syrian air defense equipment are provided by the Russians. We have the remnants of the SAA forces in a place called Yurin in northern Syria. They've laid down their weapons and are seemingly, marching on. A lot of them took off their uniforms and have, either tried to sort of publicly join the rebels, or I think merging in with the background in an attempt not to be found out. Here, Kim Khatas says, some Syrian friends in Beirut are already on the road to Damascus. No one ever wants to be a refugee, live in a foreign land, close or far, but no one wants to live under murderous regimes, risk prison or death. Friends in Damascus are reporting celebrations on the streets. It's 5:30 a.m. there, and that was obviously earlier today. The point here is that, we can go back to 2016 and Brexit, and if you remember, if you're in Britain, the visuals of Syrian refugees pouring out of Syria that Nigel Farage showed on a UKIP poster, that was really dodgy, or a Leave poster. It was really dodgy because these weren't refugees in Europe, and it was really disingenuous use of them. But there was an impact on European migration, and there has been since then and before then. Syria has been a major thorn in the side of immigration within Europe. And one would hope that all of those Syrian refugees will now have hope and a desire to go to their homeland, because quite often people think, refugees, they just want to come here and take advantage of our X, Y, and Z, without understanding that they don't really want to be leaving their country very often. These people have been born and brought up, they speak the language, they don't speak a foreign language. They are just having to leave their country, particularly to local places like Turkey that have seen an awful lot of Syrian refugees. Those people will be wanting to return. There will be a lot of excitement and a lot of hope for the future of Syria. But of course, it's going to be chaotic, and my goodness, we don't know which way it's going to go, but I'm fairly confident it'll be better than what Assad was offering. Okay, Anton Gerashenko says, now, and these were rumours that have been going around all day, there's a possibility that Assad's plane, which was fleeing Syria, could have been shot down by a Russian S-300 air defense system in Tartus. Meanwhile, the official flight radar page on Twitter reported that the plane, which could have been carrying the Syrian dictator, disappeared from radar in an area with GPS interference. That could have caused the signal loss, though, as well. So lots of rumours going that he has his plane was shot down. There are rumours that he's got to Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, Moscow. There are all sorts of things going on. Now, two Syrian sources told Reuters that the Assad plane may have crashed, but it's not been confirmed. And Russia said Assad had left the country after deciding to set down. That's a quote from Ynet News. Shashank Joshi there repeating that. And then we've heard from No Report saying that reports of Assad's death in a plane crash are Russian disinformation, says Ukrainian intelligence. The loss of the plane's radar signal was likely due to actions by the crew following Russian instructions during the flight. So lots of rumours. I wouldn't believe anything at the moment without much evidence. Now, there will be lots of immediate ramifications to what's going on in Syria. So, for example, the Iranian tanker Lotus heading for Syria has made a U-turn in the Gulf of Suez. She is loaded with 750,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil. There will be lots of people going, we were just on the way to Syria, on the way to Tartus, on the way to, coming out of Syria, going into Syria. There will be lots of changes of behaviour as a result of what's going on. Now, we have seen that Assad's palace has been basically ransacked. A video of the Assad family bunker here. The footage was taken in a shelter under the palace of Bashar al-Assad's younger brother. Quote, there are lots of weapons, gold, and a gold-bound Quran here. You can also see an armoured door leading to the vault. I assume there are going to be some very rich people coming out of this these days, who weren't very rich a couple of days ago, as Assad's riches are plundered. Indeed, look at this. This is absolutely incredible. So this is Assad's car fleet. Just incredible. He was definitely a man of the people. All dictators are greedy narcissists, all of them, says this source. So absolutely incredible. I want to know, in fact, let's go back to the beginning of this. I want to know what Assad had use, what use he had for these camper vans at the end, or RVs as the Americans call them. So lots of lovely cars, many with their bonnets up and work being done on them. And then you got some random, pretty bog standard camper vans. You're like, can you imagine Bashar al-Assad just go, I'm either going to go out for a spin in the old Ferrari Testarossa, or I'm going to take out the camper van and we can have a nice weekend around the lake, during the Civil War. Do you know what I mean? It's really bizarre. Anyway, a huge number of vehicles, and of course, you can imagine they'll be on the streets of Damascus pretty soon. Okay, what else is going on? So Tendar says, so many are asking what comes next after the fall of Assad, but that question will take time when we look at Syria herself. More urgent is a question of what happens abroad, and here you do not have to go too far in order to answer that question. Lebanon is now in a unique situation which hasn't been since the civil war in the 1970s and 1980s. Hezbollah has been severely weakened even before Assad's fall, but now they are completely cut off from Iran. This is what I was saying earlier. And in fact, you've had Netanyahu has come out and publicly said, yeah, we are the ones responsible for this. And actually, Israel do play a part in the successful collapse of the Syrian regime, as Ukraine does. Russia are weak because of Ukraine. Iran are weak because of Israel. Israel been hitting Iran and hitting ballistic missile factories, etc., but also taking out Hezbollah. And you can talk about whether Israel's policies, or not policies, methods were legal and right, and we can have that argument. But let's forget that. Let's take the morality out of it and just understand that they have battered Hezbollah recently, and Hezbollah are Iranian backed, and they get their weapons across Syria and into Lebanon. And Israel, having knackered them for the last couple of weeks, couple of months, has now paved the way for the Syrian rebel forces to feel emboldened to do what they are doing, because there is a little comeuppance from Hezbollah and Russia as well. So the important land route from Tehran to Beirut is severed. Planes from Tehran cannot fly directly, if at all, to Beirut, and supply from the sea takes time to be established, time neither the mullahs in Iran nor Hezbollah has. Syria is now an enemy for Hezbollah and Iran. The power structures in the region have completely flipped, and it is fair to say that we are in uncharted waters, but I believe that it is a positive trajectory. Iran and Russia have lost a valuable foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean, and both have zero alternatives for this decisive blow. Interesting. Assad's downfall, says Jason Corcoran, in Syria has shaken Putin, likely hardening his stance on Ukraine. The 3-year war in Ukraine has cost Russia its hold on Syria, a key Middle Eastern ally, further deepening Putin's reluctance to compromise amid growing challenges domestically and overseas. So very obviously, and I've talked about this a lot recently, without having Tartus there, the Russians do not have a port in the Mediterranean, and that gives them access, a bit like Sevastopol in Crimea. The rationale for the Russians really desperately wanting that is you have a deep sea warm water port, i.e. a port that doesn't freeze over in the winter like all the other Russian ports do, or if they don't freeze out, but they freeze directly, then the sea around them does. And that means that they need something like Sevastopol and or Tartus in order to access the Mediterranean, and therefore the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and therefore Suez Canal and Indian Ocean, etc., etc. So these ports are super, super important. But then you have the airfields that allow them to land their cargo planes in order to supply all the African nations where they are operating with troops and forces and resources, and likewise take back the booty, basically the loot that they get from Africa in terms of diamonds and this and that. They take that back through Syria to Russia. This will severely impact Russia to a fairly significant degree. This will materially weaken Russia, but politically weaken Russia possibly as well. I think that there will be many people in the Russian public and in the kind of blogosphere, military bloggers, who will be questioning whether it was all worth it, etc., etc. Some people, I was watching news earlier, and someone was commenting that there will be Russians wondering why they were there in the first place. I think anyone who knows, like those reasons I've just given you, they should be obvious enough, but I don't know whether the Russian public has communicated that or whether they understand it as part of a work against terrorism in the area type thing. There's always a lot more going on with Russia than they're not going to be worried about putting an end to certain forms of terrorism outside of their country, etc., etc. Now, Gabrielius Landsbergis, the former foreign minister for Lithuania, says the Syrian example shows that Russia can be kicked out and will go home. The Baltics were right. The West is strong enough to win. We don't need to fear the bear in Ukraine or anywhere else. He is causing chaos. Absolutely spot on. I won't play that now, but you get the idea. Landsbergis is such a fine interlocutor, fine advocate for Ukraine and against Russia. Ben Hodges, former General Ben Hodges, says Russia's continuing disregard for international law should give pause to talk about negotiations with Ukraine. With the fall of Assad regime, Russia will make a deal with someone else to keep this lucrative criminal activity going. Loss of their naval base in Tartus could be a real problem for Kremlin. And it's going to be fascinating to see what goes on in the Mediterranean, given that they've lost Tartus. Russian stolen grain transportation has been disrupted. Tartus-bound Matros Pozhnik is adrift west of Cyprus, waiting for instructions. This is huge. They were using Tartus as a route, as a waypoint for the stolen grain from Ukraine, from occupied territories of Ukraine. So again, some pretty material impact on Russia's activities. Now, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, calls the fall of Assad's regime a positive and long-awaited event, linking it to the weakness of Russia and Iran. She emphasised the EU's priority of regional security and vowed to work with all constructive partners to stabilise the region. So the EU is going to be very, like I said earlier, very interested in working with Syria to make sure that it's stable, because it's on the borders of the EU. We know that the impact that Syria has had on migration. They would like to see migrants go back to Syria, probably because of social cohesion tensions. I know Germany's got a lot of Syrian migrants. Berlin, there were rallies today, gatherings today of Syrians who are particularly happy. I presume the EU is going to be wanting there to be a lot more stability there than has been seen over the last decade or so. That's not to say they're going to, round up Syrians and send them back, but you get my point. That the EU has a vested interest in making sure there's stability in Syria. Luke Coffey here says, with events in Syria and the state of the Russian economy, we have entered a rare window of opportunity to take advantage. Every foreign policy decision in the coming months should prioritise a weakening of Moscow. 100%. This is absolutely crucial. So as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Luke Coffey, he says every policy decision in coming months should prioritise the weakening of Moscow. Now is the time to turn the screw on Russia like never before. This is absolutely 100% right, and I'm worried that Trump has today come out and said, it's interesting he said that you will see less aid going to Ukraine from the US when he's in power, which is interesting because that's moved from no aid to less aid. So that's potentially good, but this should be the time. It should be the time where Trump. The problem is, this isn't really about Trump, of course. It's about Syria, but I get really frustrated when people think that someone like Trump is really good at doing deals, where he shows himself to be literally the worst deal maker you can possibly imagine. Like, people that shout about how wonderful he is just don't have clear lenses. The man lays out his cards before he even begins doing negotiations. You don't say, before you go into negotiations with Putin, we are going to send less aid to Ukraine. I mean, first of all, he said we're going to send no aid. Now he's saying we're going to send less aid. It's just, you don't say anything. Strategic ambiguity. It's just really, really bloody frustrating. But what you should, in fact, if you're going to say anything, you should say we are going to be giving an absolute freaking ton of aid to Ukraine. You go the other way, because by saying what he's saying at the moment, it is clear that he wants to help Russia more than he wants to help Ukraine. So if he really wanted to help Ukraine, you threaten Russia with lots of aid, you go to negotiations, and then you can take that aid back to suit Russia so that Russia give, and that's how you compromise. But they're going in the other way. So they're starting negotiations with Russia, the US, on behalf of Ukraine, saying, we're going to give no or very little aid to Ukraine. Russia are like, brilliant, that's a great starting point, thank you very much. So you're starting from very little, and we're going to screw you down to none at all, and then give us some stuff. So, terrible deal making. This is the point. Luke Coffey's got it right. You want to be screwing Russia over even more now because they have shown themselves to be absolutely weak. Dmytro Kuleba, Foreign Minister for Ukraine, said, as I predicted here a week ago, Putin has thrown Assad under the bus to prolong his war in Ukraine. Now, this is the worry. So his resources are scarce, and he's not as strong as he pretends. To those claiming Russia cannot be defeated and that Ukraine must concede, or those arguing that the West lacks resources to confront Putin, you better stop misleading the public and advancing the agenda of a great Russia. Being eventually exposed as fools and losers is likely not something you're looking forward to. The strategies that gained prominence during the Cold War, on the assumption that Russia matters now, risk leading the West to defeat in this era of hot wars waged by Russia to showcase Western weakness to the whole world. Now's the time to be strong. And then we'll build on that point in a second. But I'm just going to throw this one in. Michael Weiss saying HTS, so these are the main group that have been doing most of the activities in the last few days. HTS, rather than Senate Republicans scuttling Tulsi's appointment as DNI, is a distinct and particularly funny possibility. This is pretty amusing. So it could be that instead of Democrats and Republicans arguing about whether Tulsi Gabbard should be the Director of National Intelligence for the Trump administration, it seems that she may get scuttled by actually the HTS, so this rebel group headed by Jelani. John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Trump, has said it's going to be very interesting to see what the files that may be uncovered in the Syrian government are if the rebels succeed in capturing Damascus, which they have. This was 20 hours ago. What they show about a number of Americans. The idea that there might well be files that get found that incriminates someone like Tulsi Gabbard. Fascinating. Anyway, moving on, where do we get to in some of these Russian sources? Now, this is the one that I'm particularly worried about. Okay, so Dmitry from War Translators says the benefit from withdrawing from Syria equals 1,500 Mavics per day to Ukraine. Simple and straightforward maths. Okay, so this is a Russian source saying, now seriously, these are the negative points to losing Syria for the Russians. Loss of transit point for our supplies to Africa, which also includes from Africa as well. Loss of a naval base in a region dominated by NATO countries. Loss of the ability to kill radicals from Central Asia outside the territory of the Russian Federation. It's a great shame for those hundreds of our men from the Wagner PMC, the Special Operations Forces, the Aerospace Forces and the Russian Ministry of Defense who gave their lives in the Syrian war. It was they, and not the brave Syrians, who saved Assad's SAR from destruction in 2015 to 2020. However, there are also advantages if the bases are abandoned. 1. The group's supplies cost Russia at least $3 million a day. That's estimated. That's 1,500 Mavics a day. 2. Troops are needed for the final battle in 2025 for Ukraine. And stop helping strangers when our own are in need. It says, but those first two, this is my worry for what's happening in Syria. What's happening in Syria is a good thing, but there are some negative consequences, and one of them might well be that Russia will find itself with more money, more resources, and more troops to send to Ukraine to fight against the Ukrainians, and that is definitely something of an issue. And I've heard this I mentioned this over the last couple of days, just from common sense, right? But actually, a number of analysts have now mentioned this. Now, Recep Soylu saying, a former Air Force pilot and one of Russia's most renowned war correspondents, Captain Ilya Tumanov, says, quote, "We are leaving Syria. Preparations for the withdrawal of equipment have begun. Syria is over. The Turks took Syria without a fight. It looks like we have reached an agreement with Turkey. Syria is theirs now. We have been stabbed in the back again." So Turkey are going to be the most important single entity in what happens now. But what is interesting is that at least some Russians feel that Turkey has stabbed them in the back. And remember, Turkey are supposed to be the big, not quite allies, but someone on the inside, if you like, in terms of they're not in the EU, but they were EU facing, they were Western facing, they're in NATO. They are allies of Ukraine technically, but they have a lot of vested interests, or a lot of Russians have vested interests in Turkey. Quite literally, they have invested in Turkey. It's a big money laundering place, and Erdogan is someone that speaks out both sides of his mouth concerning the Ukrainian conflict. But for the Russians to feel they've been stabbed in the back here by the Turks, I think that's brilliant for Ukraine. What you want is Turkey to be pushed further and further towards Ukraine. And again, the other thing that's worth noting here is when you have somewhat neutral countries, I don't mean technically neutral, I mean like sitting on a fence, not really bothered about Ukraine, and are maybe the global south, and they're looking at the US hegemony and they're thinking, BRICS is looking pretty good. We'll start siding with Russia. We'll start having investments with, so on and so forth. If you then start seeing Russia being embarrassed in Syria, and you start seeing Russia looking closer to collapse, then not out of any kind of moral desire, but you might get these sitting on the fence nations start going the other way, start looking towards the US and the EU and UK and Australia and Japan to side with, because people like to back a winning horse. And Russia, when it starts looking like more of a losing horse, it could lose more and more, and it becomes a bit of a snowball. And that's what I'd like to see from this, which is people abandoning Russia as Russia have been embarrassed in Syria, and the international community recognise that, and they lose power and they lose kudos around the world more and more, and then they spiral into they enter a death spiral, if you like. Tendar, finally, I'll add, Tendar says Russia has already stopped calling Syrian rebels terrorists, as I mentioned earlier, and started calling them groups of the Syrian opposition with whom contacts are already established. This is how fast Moscow can arrange with true realities on the ground, and this is exactly what will happen when Russia is defeated in Ukraine. There won't be World War III, there will be true realities on the ground, which show that Russian red lines never really existed, only in the heads of weak people. Yeah, as I always say, it's the West that invented red lines for ourselves to cross, that we perceive annoys Russia, but actually it never really existed. They never really existed in the Russian minds anyway. And I'll just pop through a couple of latest things just popping up here. Again, Tendar says the collapse of the Assad regime has left Russians all over stranded. Russian military bloggers say that this moment Russians are surrounded at several positions, such as Homs and Palmyra, but the situation at their primary bases in Latakia and Tartus, as well as in the Syrian capital, is chaotic. Even in the Kurdish regions where Russians were operating before Assad's fall, the situation is absolutely unclear. I believe that the situation is even worse than they describe, since they tried to keep OPSEC in order to keep the lives of those cut off Russians as safe as possible. However, they also say that there is not much hope for those Russians either. They are marooned and on their own. Another Russian military adventure ends in absolute catastrophe. So given the worry that there will be troops and forces that can be redeployed to Ukraine, what I would like to see, and this sounds a bit harsh from a human point of view, but I would like to see those Russian forces surrounded and abandoned in Syria in order that they cannot be redeployed against Ukraine. And that could well be what is happening, unless the Russians can do some serious special forces evacuations of. It just happened so quickly the last 10 days. I guess the Russians just wouldn't have thought it would have happened this quickly. And you think about putting contingency plans in place and evacuating, but it takes time and effort and ships and planes and all sorts, and then suddenly it's too late, and you've got people and equipment, supplies stuck in basically in a complete war zone amongst total chaos. So there you go. Anyway, that is probably enough for me, for you, for the day. Hopefully that was of use. Remember, I'm no expert on this region. I'm no expert on anything particularly. It's just, hopefully these nuggets are informative and keep you abreast at least some degree of what is going on in the region and how it pertains to the war in Ukraine particularly, and Russia. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.